We all love a hero. From the ancient epics of Homer to today's Marvel movies, stories about men and women rising against impossible odds, achieving something noble, something bigger than themselves, have always struck a deep chord. Heroes reassure us. They bring order to chaos. They conquer darkness with light. And most importantly, they give us someone to root for, someone to become. But somewhere along the way, the hero began to change. Somewhere between Clint Eastwood's scowl and Tony Soprano's therapy sessions, a new kind of figure started to dominate our stories. The anti-hero. He isn't noble, he isn't selfless, he lies, he cheats. He does what he must, not necessarily what's right. And yet he still captures our imagination. Why? Because the anti-hero reflects something uncomfortably honest. Our messy, contradictory selves. We like that he fights back. We like that he wins, even if it leaves blood on the floor. Few figures in American history embody this shift, this blur between hero and anti-hero better than Andrew Jackson. By the spring of 1814, Jackson had already done everything we might expect from a traditional hero. He'd risen from nothing, survived the backwoods of the Carolinas, educated himself in law, carved out a future on the Tennessee frontier, and led American troops to a decisive victory in the Creek War. Newspapers called him Old Hickory, a man as tough as the wood for which he was nicknamed. He was fearless, charismatic, and utterly relentless, the kind of frontier figure Americans craved in a war that had offered few victories. But that's only part of the story. There was also the Jackson who trafficked in violence with unnerving ease. The Jackson who enslaved men, women, and children. The Jackson who once threatened to kill a lieutenant over a service dispute. The Jackson who challenged political rivals to duels and carried his wounds, both literal and metaphorical, without shame. In his own time, these traits might have been tolerated, even admired. Through a modern lens, however, they complicate the narrative. They turn our war hero into something darker, flawed, brutal, and magnetic in equal measure. Jackson's story resembles the classic hero's arc. A man from the frontier rises through grit and war to save the Republic. But as we'll see, the further you follow that arc, the harder it becomes to separate hero from anti-hero. Or perhaps even outright villain. When Andrew Jackson returned to Nashville in 1814, fresh from victory at Horseshoe Bend, he wasn't just a man basking in triumph. He was a man still hungry for the next battle, still pushing forward on a journey far from over. Because while the Creeks had been broken, another far more powerful enemy was closing in from the south. And when that enemy came knocking, it would be Jackson, contradictions, charisma, and all, who would march to New Orleans and meet them head on. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Episode number 3, The Hero of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson returned to Nashville a national hero, bloodied but victorious. The Creek War was over. The Red Stick resistance had been shattered at Horseshoe Bend. Jackson's shoulder wound was healing. His wife Rachel welcomed him home, and at his side was his newly adopted Creek son, Lincoya, a symbolic gesture meant to project mercy after devastation. This was the return phase of the hero's journey, the triumphant homecoming. But if the arc was supposed to lead to peace, Jackson hadn't read that version of the script. Even as he set foot back in Tennessee, the next threat was already on the horizon. Just 4 days before his return, on May 10th, 2 British frigates dropped anchor off the coast of Spanish Florida, roughly 200 miles southeast of Pensacola. A detachment of Royal Marines came ashore and disappeared into the swamps and pine forests, seeking the remnants of Red Stick warriors who had survived Horseshoe Bend. They came bearing gifts: 2,000 British muskets and ample powder and ball, left on the white sand beaches for their new allies. A Royal Marine captain even stayed behind to train the Red Sticks and their Seminole cousins in European military tactics. The British believed they'd found fertile ground for rebellion. Minor Red Stick chiefs entertaining British officer Edward Nichols told a wildly embellished tale that the resistance remained strong, that they had the support of the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Seminoles, and even enslaved African Americans ready for an uprising. "We are the king's dutiful children in this part of the world," they claimed, asking only for more guns and ammunition. What they failed to mention was Horseshoe Bend, the war they had decisively lost, and the thousands of warriors lying buried in the ground. Still, the British believed what they wanted to hear. Flush with confidence after Napoleon's defeat in Europe, they were finally free to direct more troops and ships to the American front. Their goal was clear: seize New Orleans, control the Mississippi River, and force the U.S. to abandon its ambitions in Canada. The British captain who landed predicted that 3,000 troops could do it, especially if native allies and Spanish discontents joined their cause. Back in Tennessee, Jackson suffered no illusions. Though celebrated in Nashville, he believed the frontier remained under threat. Historian John Meacham writes, "Jackson never rested. Despite his victory, he remained convinced that the Indians were still a live threat, and more importantly, a willing tool in the hands of the British and the Spanish." That spring, he ordered defensive preparations in Mobile and began advocating for preemptive action in Spanish Florida, which he suspected was being used as a launchpad for further attacks. Washington saw things much the same. On May 22nd, Secretary of War John Armstrong offered Jackson a commission as a brigadier general in the regular army and command of the 7th Military District, covering Louisiana, Tennessee, the Mississippi Territory, and the recently subdued Creek Country. Absent any other clear American victories, Jackson's record at Horseshoe Bend stood out. He accepted, and just before leaving home again, received an even higher honor, a promotion to Major General, filling the vacancy left by William Henry Harrison's resignation. Old Hickory left Nashville on June 25th, still stiff from the wounds he'd gained in brawls before the Creek War, but commanding more power than ever. He was headed back to Fort Jackson, where peace negotiations were supposed to wrap up the war. But Jackson wasn't interested in limited reparations or symbolic gestures. He rejected the idea of simply claiming enough Creek land to pay for the war. Instead, he pushed for a massive land grab, a corridor connecting Georgia, the Mississippi Territory, and Tennessee, an unmixed buffer zone of American settlers that he said would form a bulwark against foreign invasion. In Jackson's words, "Our national security requires it. Their security requires it. The happiness and security of the whole require this salutary agreement." The whole, of course, did not include the Creek. Even the Cherokees, who had helped him defeat the Red Sticks, were asked to give up what little land they still held in Tennessee. Peace, in Jackson's eyes, was not something to be negotiated. It was something to be imposed. Though Jackson had returned home, this wasn't a rest between battles, it was a pivot. The enemy had changed. The war was shifting from the interior to the coast, from subduing natives to holding off the global power. His journey, far from ending, was entering its next stage. Every hero's journey reaches a return, a moment of supposed triumph when the hero comes home, changed by battle. But for Andrew Jackson, that return was not one of peace, but of reckoning. At Fort Jackson, the general who had risen in glory would now consolidate his power, not by honoring his allies, but by taking everything for the victors. He arrived on July 10, 1814, at the half-finished outpost that now bore his name, built on the ruins of the Creek town of Tohopeka, where just months before he had broken the Red Stick resistance. Though the fort was little more than a shell and unfit for defense, Jackson made it the headquarters of his newly acquired 7th Military District. From this symbolic high ground he began his next campaign, not a military one, but a political and territorial one, aimed at the complete submission of the Creek Nation. The very next day, Jackson ordered Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins to summon both the defeated Red Sticks and the friendly Creeks, those who had fought under him, to the fort for a treaty council on August 1st. The government's official goal was modest: secure enough land to offset the cost of the war. Jackson's vision was far more ambitious. As historian Peter Cozens explains, Jackson was driven less by land hunger than by frontier security. He believed the borders of Georgia, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Territory must be removed from the threat that Peter McQueen, Josiah Francis, and the remaining hostile Red Sticks posed, particularly because it appeared that the Spaniards and British intended to abet further conflict. But Jackson's methods weren't just strategic, they were visceral. Historian Alan Taylor writes, Jackson insisted that a proper man had to defend white women and children by destroying the greatest supposed threat to them, Indians. He lived by a bloody motto: an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and scalp for a scalp. This vengeful style thrilled many Southern men who feared Indian uprisings as well as slave revolts. For them, Jackson embodied a kind of violent security, an anti-hero whose promise of aggressive expansion could keep internal and external threats at bay. Taylor notes, fears of internal enemies interacting with external foes bred the American dream of boundlessness as security. So when the Creeks, including his native allies, gathered at Fort Jackson, Andrew Jackson shocked them by treating friend and foe alike. This war has cost the United States a large sum, he declared. You must yield as much of your land as will pay this sum. And then came the real blow. The land must be taken from your whole nation, in such a manner to destroy communication with our enemies everywhere. Your brothers, the friendly Creeks, will agree to it. They decidedly did not. Jackson demanded 22 million acres, more than half the Creek domain, encompassing much of present-day Alabama and Georgia. He insisted the Creeks give up hunting, become farmers, turn in or kill the remaining Red Stick fugitives, and allow U.S. roads and forts throughout their territories. As Cozens puts it, there was a touch of evil genius in Jackson's approach. He would end the war by concluding a harsh peace with his allies. For this, the Creeks gave him a new name: Sharp Knife. Perhaps most galling was Jackson's disregard for the very native allies who had helped him win at Horseshoe Bend, particularly the Cherokee. During the battle, Jackson's men had failed to breach the massive Red Stick wall. His advance stalled under heavy fire. The Cherokees took matter into their own hands, crossing the 120-foot wide river, stealing Creek canoes, and launching a surprise rear assault that turned the tide. Without them, Jackson's force would have collapsed. In true Jacksonian fashion, the principle of "to the victors go the spoils" was applied with brutal simplicity, but with a bitter irony. The spoils of the war came not from the defeated Red Sticks, but from the loyal native allies who had fought beside him. Jackson saw no distinction. To him, those who fought with the U.S. were no better than traitors to their own people. They had entered the ranks of an invading army, he told aide John Reed, to exterminate their own people. Like American loyalists of the Revolution, they were to be despised, not rewarded. When Big Warrior, a Creek ally, appealed for fairness, asking for compensation for personal losses, Jackson threatened to put him in chains. Yet he dangled a slim hope. If the Creeks signed the treaty, Hawkins would send their claims to your father, the president, who would pay honorably everything you ought to have. But only after Jackson insisted, we must first know our friends from our enemies. Facing no other choice, the Creek leaders signed. Of the 36 chiefs who made their marks on the Treaty of Fort Jackson, only one was a Red Stick. Big Warrior, in a remarkable gesture of gratitude to a man actively using the law to ruin his people, offered Jackson a personal gift: 3 square miles of the newly ceded land. Jackson declined, afraid of the appearances of corruption. But the real prize was already his. With the stroke of a pen, Jackson acquired over 21 million acres of what he called the cream of the Creek country. Rich farmland, hunting grounds, and future towns, all now open for auction to speculators and settlers. Its full implications would unfold over decades, setting a precedent for the removal and dispossession of not just of the Creeks, but of all native people in the Southeast, and eventually across the entire western frontier. In the traditional hero's journey, this stage is often called the road back, when the hero returns to his world bearing new power and wisdom. But Jackson's power wasn't wisdom, it was conquest. And the road ahead would not lead back home, instead taking him to New Orleans and the climax of a myth that still shapes America's view of itself. Before we follow Andrew Jackson into the swamps and cotton fields of the Gulf South, we need to step back and widen the lens. While Jackson was forging new treaties and redrawing the American frontier, the rest of the nation was tumbling into a larger, more chaotic conflict, the War of 1812. Up to now, we've mostly glanced past the war's causes, but Jackson's rise, the fighting in the South, and the coming Battle of New Orleans all flowed from deeper tensions: a crumbling peace, a broken economy, and a desperate effort to unite a divided republic via war. It begins with Thomas Jefferson, who swept into office in 1800, promising to restore the Revolution's values. Jefferson shifted American foreign policy away from Britain and towards revolutionary France. He struck a cozy relationship with Napoleon, which paid off in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. That bargain, however, only happened because of another revolution, the Haitian Revolt, the only successful slave rebellion in world history. Haiti's victory over French forces convinced Napoleon to abandon his New World ambitions, and in turn to offload Louisiana. But Jefferson, ever wary of what that rebellion represented, barred Haitian immigrants from entering the U.S., fearing they might inspire enslaved people in the South to follow suit. Jefferson sought neutrality, but the global war between Britain and France made that impossible. The most pressing issue, the British Royal Navy, desperate for manpower, began impressing sailors from American ships. Not just a few, thousands. Historian Alan Taylor notes that the British considered anyone born beneath the crown, whether it be in England, Ireland, Canada, a subject for life, regardless of naturalization. Naval captains insisted that they had the right and duty to stop any ship and retrieve their sailors. By 1807, over 9,000 British-born sailors, mostly Irish, worked on American ships, drawn by higher wages. As Taylor explains, Defining American citizens narrowly and British subjects broadly, naval captains simply took the best sailors. Americans saw it differently. This was not law, it was kidnapping, an insult to national honor. Republican ideas of the voluntary citizen clashed with Britain's notion of the perpetual subject. Newspapers and taverns erupted, men whipped at sea, American flags ignored, dignity trampled. Jefferson's response was economic. The Embargo Act of 1807. No more American ships in foreign ports. He believed it would choke British industry, stir labor unrest, and force a policy change. Instead, it crippled the U.S. economy, particularly in New England, where shipping was everything. Smuggling boomed. Jefferson expanded federal power to enforce the law. Militiamen patrolled borders, deadly shootouts erupted, livelihoods were ruined, and resentment soared. His Treasury Secretary Albert Galatian groaned, "I had rather encounter war itself than to display our impetus to enforce our own laws." Political backlash followed. The Federalist Party, nearly dead, found new life. In New England, where commerce had collapsed, Federalists accused Jefferson and his Southern allies of deliberately impoverishing the region in order to consolidate their power. Some depicted slave-owning Virginians as enemies of free white labor, enriching plantations while destroying Yankee merchants. One paper warned, "Civil war on slavery loomed." The embargo fractured the nation, rather than uniting it. Jefferson left the mess to his successor, James Madison, in 1809, but things only got worse. Maritime tensions collided with frontier violence. White settlers pushing west encountered organized native resistance, led by figures like Tecumseh, the Shawnee warrior and statesman, and his brother, the Prophet. They urged native nations to unite against U.S. expansion and rejected land sales. Indiana's territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, called Tecumseh one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolution. Tecumseh moved from the Wabash to the Mississippi, building alliances and securing British weapons for the war to come. Harrison dismissed the prophet as a fraud, challenging him to cause the sun to stand still. They say what you don't know might kill ya. In this case, what Harrison didn't know was that there was a solar eclipse due on June 16, 1806. So when the sky darkened as the prophet predicted, native faith deepened. In November 1811, with Tecumseh away, Harrison marched on Prophetstown with 1,200 troops. Warriors struck first at Tippecanoe Creek. Though Harrison repelled the attack, he lost many men. The town burned. Republicans hailed Tippecanoe as proof that British armed savages were plotting against frontier settlements. In Tennessee, one observer, Andrew Jackson, was furious, stating, "The blood of our murdered countrymen must be revenged. Those banditti and the secret agents of Great Britain must be swept from the face of the earth." Native resistance was now woven into a Republican narrative, a British conspiracy with Indians cast as merciless pawns. Newspapers merged images of naval flogging and frontier scalping, calling for the defense of sailors, women, and children from Britons and Indians alike. Enter the Warhawks. Led by Henry Clay of Kentucky, these young, brash Republicans saw war as a moral crusade. Clay dreamed of invading Canada to extinguish the torch that lights up savage warfare. War, they argued, would purify the nation, restore revolutionary virtue, and show Americans would no longer suffer insults from monarchs or savages. By late 1811, President Madison urged Congress to prepare. One Republican summed it up, stating, "The honor of the nation and that of the party are bound up together. Both will be sacrificed if war be not declared." Madison knew the country wasn't ready. Jefferson had shrunk the army to just 3,000 men, barely enough to defend a 10,000-mile frontier and a 20,000-mile coastline. Yet the president said, "I knew the unprepared state of the country, but I esteemed it was necessary to throw forward the flag, sure the people would press forward and defend it." In June 1812, Congress declared war, the first in U.S. history. Every single Federalist in Congress voted against it. 81% of Republicans supported it. The War of 1812 had begun not with a bang, but a brawl. In Baltimore, Republican mobs attacked Federalists, tearing down newspapers, smashing windows, and beating prisoners while women shouted, "Kill the Tories!" One man died, 11 were maimed, and a jury acquitted the rioters. Meanwhile, Republican plans to invade Canada faltered. Early victories went to the British, who rallied native support and forced General Hull to surrender Detroit without firing a shot. Even as Americans briefly occupied York, present-day Toronto, in 1813, they burned the Parliament buildings and looted the town. Prophetstown and York became the first capitals destroyed in the War of 1812, but they weren't the last. Behind the failures was a broken war effort. The army was tiny, undertrained, and poorly led. Officers were often political appointees, more practiced in duels than actual combat. Pay was low, enlistments short, and land incentives insufficient. State militias, hastily called, refused to cross into Canada. At the same time, enslaved African Americans saw Britain as a potential liberator. Hundreds joined the British as colonial marines. Congress tried to fix things in 1814, raising pay, doubling land bounties, and offering cash bonuses. But by then, Britain, freed from Napoleon, struck out in force, from Montreal to Maine, the Chesapeake to New Orleans. In August, British troops burned the U.S. Capitol and White House. In September, Americans barely held Baltimore, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. The final offensive, New Orleans, remained in suspense as the year closed. Internally, divisions festered. Federalists in New England opposed the war from the start, resenting domination by slaveholding Virginians and even flirting with secession. By 1815, Republicans had their war, but not the quick, cheap, or glorious conflict they envisioned. Conquering Canada proved far harder than Jefferson imagined. Instead, they faced military collapse, regional rebellion, and the literal burning of their capital. They fought for independence and honor, but exposed just how fragile both remained. Jackson's actions in ignoring federal guidance regarding the Treaty of Fort Jackson revealed the general's rebellious streak. The people of Tennessee had long known about Jackson's difficulties with authority. Numerous times he blatantly ignored orders to concentrate on what he viewed as the greater good. Now Washington was put on notice. Jackson, a backwoods general who disdained federal caution and diplomacy, operated with the autonomy of a regional governor and the impunity of a conqueror. With the Creek War seemingly ended, Jackson's focus shifted to the next far greater threat, the British forces assembling along the Gulf Coast. During the War of 1812, Britain had sought to use native discontent as a wedge against the young American Republic. Their most committed allies in the South were the Red Stick Creeks, survivors of Horseshoe Bend, like Josiah Francis and Peter McQueen, men who had fled into Spanish-held Florida. There in Pensacola, they regrouped under the protection of the Spanish garrison and British allies. The English presence in Pensacola was more formidable than at any previous point in the Gulf campaign. Admiral Alexander Cochrane, newly arrived with 8,000 redcoats, far more than he had initially requested, prepared to launch a southern offensive. While he remained sympathetic to native resistance, Cochrane no longer depended on Creek warriors as auxiliaries. As a result, the Red Sticks were able to avoid major pitched battles, spiking their cannons and evacuating their soldiers to instead try and flank Jackson at sea. The British now had the manpower to challenge American control directly, without relying on their indigenous alliances. To Jackson, Pensacola was a red flag, not only a base for British troops and Red Stick remnants, but a political insult. Despite Spanish neutrality, the city had become a launching pad for British imperial ambitions. When Madison sent a restrained directive cautioning Jackson to respect Spanish sovereignty, Jackson dismissed it outright. Invoking the broad principle of self-preservation, he announced his intention to strike preemptively. In early November 1814, Jackson marched into West Florida with 4,000 American troops and 700 Choctaw allies. The seizure of Pensacola was swift. British troops evacuated the town after destroying their own fortifications. Spanish forces, outmatched and unwilling to provoke further conflict, quickly surrendered. Jackson paraded triumphantly through the city, declaring its liberation from foreign interference. But this was not conquest for conquest's sake. Jackson believed that rooting out the Red Sticks and their redcoat abettors in Pensacola would, in his words, put an end to the Indian War in the South, severing them from European support. In reality, Pensacola was only a prelude. Jackson understood that the true British objective was New Orleans, the gateway to the Mississippi River, and the entire interior of the North American continent. Knowing the British would strike soon, Jackson withdrew westward. He had little time, limited men, and a city in urgent need of defense. In December 1814, New Orleans was a city under siege. British troops were gathering for a full-scale invasion, hoping to seize the port and control the Mississippi. Jackson, who had returned from Pensacola with battle-hardened troops, imposed martial law. When a federal judge tried to issue a writ of habeas corpus to release a detained civilian, Jackson had the judge jailed. He would later be fined for this action, and decades later would demand Congress reimburse him for it, which it eventually did. In assembling a defense, Jackson drew together an unlikely and deeply diverse army. It included Tennessee and Kentucky militia, local Creoles, pirates under the command of Jean Lafitte, and native allies. He also recruited 600 free black volunteers, promising them equal pay and the chance to prove themselves as patriots, despite protests from some white slaveholders. He dismissed their concerns flatly. They must be either for us or against us. Distrust them and you make them your enemies. Jackson also pressed thousands of enslaved men into service. Though not armed, they played a vital role, building defenses and moving supplies through flooded terrain and cold winter rains. Their labor would prove critical. Then, on December 23rd, Jackson received alarming news. A large British force had landed south of New Orleans and taken position at a nearby sugar plantation. In a bold and violent move, Jackson ordered a night attack. American soldiers swarmed the British camp, wielding muskets, tomahawks, and knives in close-quarter combat. The surprise assault left British bodies strewn across the cane fields and disrupted their timetable. It was not a decisive victory, but it sent a clear message. Jackson would strike first, and with fury. The Americans fell back a mile and immediately began preparing for a full-scale invasion. Jackson accurately predicted the British approach. All through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, his men, a patchwork of Tennessee militiamen, Creole volunteers, Choctaw allies, enslaved laborers, and pressed freedmen, worked around the clock. With the advice of the pirate chief, they extended their rampart deep into the swamp, closing off a dangerous flank. Over the next 2 weeks, they constructed a formidable defense, a half-mile earthen wall bristling with 8 batteries of artillery, fronted by a 10-foot wide moat filled with water from the Mississippi. On one side lay the mighty river, on the other an impenetrable cypress swamp. On December 27th, British guns opened fire, sinking the American gunboat Carolina in a fiery blast. Another vessel, the Louisiana, escaped upriver and took position across from Jackson's lines. The next day, the British advanced in full daylight, thousands of redcoats in tight formation moving in columns across the field. American rifles and artillery tore into their ranks, and by mid-afternoon the British commander, General Edward Pachamon, called off the assault. The American line held. Still, the worst was yet to come. On New Year's Day, 1815, the British launched a full artillery barrage, hoping to destroy Jackson's defenses and spear it in one stroke. Cannons roared across the field for hours. Jackson's headquarters at the McCarty plantation was struck repeatedly, over 100 cannonballs in the first 10 minutes alone. But he and his staff escaped uninjured, covered with dust, but resolute. It was during this barrage that the legendary pirate artillerymen proved their worth. According to German merchant Vincent Nolte, the main British battery focused its fire on Dominique U and Rinaldo Beluche, who manned two massive 24-pounders. At one point, as Dominique U observed the enemy through a spyglass, a cannonball wounded his arm. "I will pay them for that," he shouted, then had his arm hastily bound before returning to his gun. His retaliatory shot obliterated a British gun carriage and killed several men. When another British shot knocked one of his cannons off its mount, he shrugged off his injury as only some scratch by gar, and fired his other cannon, this time loaded with chain shot. The shot disabled a major British gun and killed or wounded 6 more. By noon, 2/3 of the British guns had been silenced. Their situation was becoming dire. Encamped for over a week, their supplies were nearly gone, and they had resorted to raiding nearby plantations for food. The British general had just learned that 2,000 reinforcements were en route, but wouldn't arrive in time for a coordinated push. Jackson, by contrast, sat behind strong defenses with a steady supply of ammunition, thanks in no small part to the pirate smugglers. But even he felt the weight of what was coming. On January 7th, he spent most of the afternoon observing the British camp from the battered plantation. The British were massing for a final push. They will attack at daybreak, he predicted. The attack came on January 8th, 1815. It was a Sunday morning cloaked in fog. Thousands of redcoats advanced across open cane fields, drums pounding, banners flying, directly into American musket and artillery fire. On Jackson's left, the elite 95th Regiment managed to wade across the defensive ditch. But without siege equipment or scaling ladders, they were forced to hack steps into muddy ramparts with their bayonets, a futile and desperate act. Nearby, the 44th Foot halted in confusion and began firing on the American position, despite orders to keep moving. In response, they were met with a withering volley from Carroll's Tennesseans and John Adair's Kentuckians. Within minutes, the regiment collapsed in full retreat. In less time than one can write it, recalled British Quartermaster, the 44th Foot was swept from the face of the earth. Within 5 minutes, the regiment seemed to vanish from sight. From his central position behind the line, Jackson ordered a temporary ceasefire so that the smoke could clear. As the fog lifted, the enemy's position became starkly visible, perfect for another devastating barrage. At Battery Number 3, Captain Dominique U, the grinning pirate-turned-artilleryman, stood at his guns with blackened cheeks and eyes red from powder smoke. Jackson turned to his staff and declared, "If I were ordered to storm the gates of hell with Captain Dominique as my lieutenant, I would have no misgivings of the result." In just 25 minutes, the British Army had lost nearly its entire leadership on the field. All 3 major generals were down. The lead commander of the expedition had been shot from his horse and killed, possibly by riflemen on the American right. 7 colonels fell alongside him, along with 75 other officers. The British lines broke. Chaos swept the field. A Kentucky militiaman later wrote, "When the smoke had cleared and we could obtain a fair view of the field, it looked at first glance like a sea of blood. It was not blood itself, but the red coats in which the British soldiers were dressed. The field was entirely covered in prostrate bodies." Even Jackson seemed stunned. "I never had so grand and awful an idea of the resurrection as on that day," he later wrote. "After the smoke of the battle had cleared off somewhat, I saw in the distance more than 500 Britons emerging from the heaps of their dead comrades, coming forward and surrendering as prisoners of war. These soldiers had dropped in the first volley and survived by lying still beneath corpses." By mid-morning, most of the British guns were silent. Their surviving ranks were broken and fleeing. Their wounded commander was already dead, his body later shipped back to England, preserved in a barrel of rum, a grim necessity for the transatlantic journey. Arriving at the battlefield just as the fighting had ended, Jean Lafitte, returning from an inspection of his stores, could scarcely comprehend the scale of the American victory. "I was almost out of breath, running through the bushes and the mud," he said. "My hands were bruised, my clothing torn, my feet soaked. I could not believe the result of the battle." American casualties were shockingly low. Just 62 killed, wounded, or missing. The British had suffered more than 2,000. For the British Empire, it was one of the most humiliating defeats of the age. For Jackson, it was the making of a legend. Watching from a distance were the Red Stick leaders who had once resisted Jackson and now found themselves allied with a broken British army. They had seen this kind of slaughter before at Horseshoe Bend, and may have wondered if Jackson was not a man at all, but a kind of reincarnated conqueror, a modern Hernando de Soto, returning from the grave to exact a fate they could not outrun. New Orleans erupted in celebration. The city's Catholic leaders declared Jackson an agent of divine providence. Newspapers across the young nation hailed the victory as a second American Revolution. But the war was already over. Just 2 weeks earlier, on December 24, 1814, American and British diplomats had signed the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. It restored the territorial status quo. No land changed hands, and there were no reparations or major policy changes. Critically, for Native Americans, Article 9 of the treaty promised that all indigenous groups involved in the war would have restored to them all possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed in 1811. On paper, this clause invalidated the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which had taken millions of acres of Creek land by force and driven the Red Sticks into exile. But the promise would not hold. The U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Ghent in February 1815, but with the Native Rights Clause struck out. Jackson, newly crowned as America's hero, or perhaps anti-hero, dismissed the treaty's provisions as irrelevant. For him, the land had been won in battle, and it would remain American soil. When Red Stick leaders tried to return home, he branded them outlaws. Any notion that peace would restore justice was shattered. Jackson had long made a career of ignoring limits and defying orders. As a teenage prisoner during the Revolutionary War, he refused to shine a British officer's boots and was slashed across the face for his insolence. As a lawyer and judge, he once threatened to kill a man who would not turn himself in. He fought duels with lethal precision and pursued enemies with brutal disregard for instructions. During the Creek War, he disobeyed orders to wait for reinforcements, attacking the Red Sticks instead and forcing through a peace on his own terms. Now, with the Treaty of Ghent threatening to undo his work, Jackson again chose defiance. In June 1815, the Secretary of War urged him to honor Article 9. In pursuance of the stipulations of the 9th article of the Treaty of Ghent, he wrote, "The President is confident that you will cooperate with all means in your power to appease the Indians upon the principles of our agreement with Great Britain." Jackson refused. Appease the Creeks? Return their land? Not a chance. The Treaty of Fort Jackson was his treaty, and it would stand. Both the Madison administration and His Majesty's government be damned. He argued disingenuously that the Red Sticks were residents of Spanish West Florida, and thus not protected by the treaty. Friendly Creeks, having freely signed the Treaty of Fort Jackson, were also excluded by his logic. No one overruled him. Jackson spoke not just for himself, but for the rising Western interests that now dominated the Democratic-Republican Party. Cozen's writes, "Neither the Secretary of War nor President Madison dared overrule him, and so Jackson continued to remove friendly Creeks from the ceded country unimpeded." And so the war ended, not with diplomacy, but with gunfire and blood. The Treaty of Ghent ended hostilities between nations, but for native peoples, particularly the Creek and their Red Stick faction, it changed nothing. Their lands were gone, and the United States would not be giving them back. Jackson had defied international law, trampled constitutional rights, violated foreign sovereignty, and reshaped race relations in the region. And for this, he was celebrated, not censured. The British had been repelled, the Spanish embarrassed, and the native resistance that had once stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes lay in ruins. The war was over, but Andrew Jackson's rise had just begun. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.